I'm Anjali Goswami. I am the president of the Linnean Society, and it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you here tonight for our annual Christmas lecture. Now, our Christmas lecture tonight is by Professor Dame, I don't know the order, Professor Dame Commander E.J. Milner-Gilland, who is the Tasso Leventis Professor of Biodiversity and the Director of the Interdisciplinary Center for Conservation Science at the University of Oxford. EJ is an incredibly prolific and influential scientist in the field of conservation science. Her works are have had huge impact across the world. Four Steps for the Earth, published in 2021, is just one of the many things that she has worked on that has actually been taken up by the international community to guide her approach to the natural world. EJ conducted her undergraduate studies at the University of Oxford, and then did her PhD at Imperial, where she graduated in 1991 with a thesis focusing on the international wildlife trade. And then following stints at the University of Warwick and Imperial, she landed back at Oxford, where she has been ever since. She was celebrated for her amazing work in conservation science by being named Dame Commander in 2023. And she received the Society of Conservation Biologists Distinguished Service Award in 2019 and the Marsh Award for Conservation Biology in 2001. Her research is really focusing on several different aspects of conservation of wildlife, including understanding resource user incentives, planning for effective and socially just conservation, and accounting for social and economic system dynamics. She's really focused on, as I mentioned earlier, the illegal wildlife trade, in particular about saiga antelope, which, as I mentioned to her earlier, is my favorite kind of antelope. These are the most unusual and really gorgeous animals. So her work on this particular species has been really, really important, including being the founder and chair of the Saiga Conservation Alliance. She has worked, she's also an advisor to the IUCN and to the Convention for the Conservation of Migratory Wild Animals. She is the chair of the UK government's Darwin Expert Committee and a trustee for WWF UK. So she is obviously an incredibly productive and influential person in the field of conservation biology. And for all of those of you who are familiar with our work, the Linnean Society, this is an area that we are really dedicated to. And so it is really my great pleasure to welcome EJ tonight to talk to us tonight about her work in conservation and really about the topic of finding optimism in a time of biodiversity crisis. So thank you, EJ, and I hope you all can be looking.
Thank you very much, and thank you for turning out on a cold, wet Thursday night to come here. It's a great honour to be here in this ancient society, this wonderful building, and to be in the room where Darwin and Wallace talked about evolution. Wow, what an honour and a privilege. So I'm going to talk to you today about optimism, but maybe we start off with a bit of pessimism. Well, then we'll have a narrative arc in this talk. So first of all, I thought you might be interested to hear this. See if anyone can guess what it is.
The beekeeper. No.
Close. It's a baiji, now only found on the internet, no longer found in real life. So yeah, sad. Here's another sad thing. Which was from 2022, a tweet about a fish that is no longer. And this is the latest thing that hit the news only a couple of weeks ago, the Slenderbill curlew. This is a picture that was taken in 1984 in Yemen. It hasn't been seen since 1995 and was declared extinct, just last month. So that's on the species front. We're also facing really quite alarming tipping points in the function of our ecosystems that underpin our health, our well-being, and our existence, really. So these are some areas that are particularly at risk of tipping, including the jet stream, which keeps us warm as a country and not icebound, given our northern latitude, and the tropical forests that are the lungs of the planet. So far, so optimistic, eh? These kinds of issues are starting to become a little bit more mainstreamly aware now. So the World Economic Forum every year publishes a list of things that are most likely to keep bankers awake at night. And for the last number of years, kind of environmental issues, including biodiversity loss, have been pretty much up there as kind of in the top 10, if not in the upcoming 2 years, at least in the next 10 years. So there is awareness coming now out there that the biodiversity crisis is a problem. And that's not only with WEF, it's also with things like the UN and with the public as well. So the Economic Intelligence Unit showing that people are much more concerned now about biodiversity loss than they were even a few years ago. We've been here before, of course. Those of us who remember the 1970s will remember Save the Whales, Save the Rainforest, and all the public angst and outcry about the loss of nature. So that's been an undercurrent and is still going on. So what do we as scientists do in the face of these big concerns and, starting public and industry and government starting to wake up? Now, one of the things that scientists do is to publish warnings. So this one was signed by many, many scientists and has been very widely quoted. The World Scientist Warning to Humanity Part 2, which was published a few years ago. Now, for me, it's not actually a terribly helpful thing to do, to start wagging your finger at people and saying, we told you and you didn't do anything, humanity, wake up and do better. I don't think that kind of language really helps. So I'm trying to think in this talk about what other kinds of ways can we talk to people about these biodiversity crises in a way that doesn't lecture and doesn't sow fear and dismay. And the reason for that is that there's a lot of literature out there that makes it pretty clear that people don't like to hear that kind of thing. So scary information causes people to turn away, to disengage. They may be angry for a bit, but it's very hard to maintain these kinds of feelings. And so if we want to change people's behavior, we can't just rely on negative messaging about how bad things are. And in a paper we published a few years ago, we thought about, what are the things that we can do? And, there's a threat and you have the awareness of the threat, and that works for a little bit, but then after a bit, you have to turn away from that threat for your own well-being. We can keep people going for a little way, but then after a bit, if we don't kind of give them something more positive, some kind of sense of community, then they will disengage and eventually burn out. And so we need to find ways to build community and build agency so that people can actually move towards the transformation that we all need. So I have had the privilege over a 30-year career now to mentor, guide and teach hundreds and hundreds of students. And I think anyone in academia who has had anything to do with students will say that that's their proudest legacy. And it certainly is mine. And those students go out into the world, and most of them go into conservation, either academic, but often into conservation practice. And I feel like I have some kind of responsibility to them to try to find a way to keep them able to cope, able to avoid that burnout that I just talked about in the last slide. And that issue, that responsibility was no more apparent than with the work I've been doing in Cambodia over the years. So I've been a PI on projects with students, and then my students have gone on to work in Cambodia. At least 10 of them have been technical advisors or scientific directors for mostly for the Wildlife Conservation Society in their work in Cambodia. So here's me, a student, an ex-student, and a couple of colleagues in Saimaa protected area, which is in the southeast of Cambodia, just near the Vietnamese border. We're standing having an evening beer, and behind us is this enormous, beautiful protected area where many of my ex-students have worked. Now let's see if this works. I just click it. Oh no, had my sister up for me. I can't make the music work. Oh, here, that's why. Excellent. So this is a gibbon calling. And this is what I heard when I was in Saimaa. It was a gibbon and somebody else. So Saimaa is pretty special. It had tigers. It was the last place in Cambodia to have tigers. Okay, let's just stop that. You got the idea.
Yeah,
Okay. Oh, it's rather lovely, isn't it? You've had the gibbon idea anyway, so. Okay. So tigers, Gaur, Banteng. It has the world's largest population of Duke langur, still has elephants. It also has 21 species of woodpecker. 16 species have been found there that are new to science. It's an amazing place. But these are also pictures that I and my students took in and around the protected area. This car graveyard is cars that were used to transport hardwood out of the forest. You can see some guys there on their motorbikes coming out of the forest with rosewood. There's also small scale agriculture clearing the forest. There's also bushmeat. So it's under huge amounts of pressure. And that pressure has led to the loss of life. So in 2018, 3 rangers were killed by border guards patrolling in the protected area. So these pressures have led to, amongst other things, widespread deforestation. So in fact, one of the forest reserves near there is still, you can still see a sign saying welcome to the forest reserve in the middle of a small town. This is the what was the field station right in the heart of the forest. Now you can see it's right on the edge. If you see here, within the buffer zone, you can see some kind of squares of deforestation, and those are economic land concessions that were granted by the government for ex-soldiers or influential people to come and clear the forest to grow crops, and that's inside the protected area. So it's tough. However, here's some optimism. It's not nearly as tough as it could have been. So the red is the deforested area, and the orange is the projection of what would have been deforested in the absence of conservation action. And you can see substantial gains of forest that is still there that would otherwise not be there. So I think with this particular case study, the point is there is still a special forest. There is still a forest that has all this wonderful biodiversity. It's under pressure, but the conservation optimism, the conservation win there is that it is still there. And sometimes that is all you can hope. I'm going to talk about my favourite species, the saiga. As we heard, very interesting nose. And I'm going to call it resurrection and see if you think at the end whether this is a slightly different kind of optimism. So just a quick thing about saigas, because you need to know. It's a very glamorous species. It lives on the steppes of Central Asia. Only the males bear horns. It's a migratory species that covers huge areas, and there's 5 populations. There's the one in the far west, which is in Russia, 3 basically in Kazakhstan, and then one which is a different subspecies over in the corner in Mongolia. I'm mostly going to talk about the middle one called the Ustjurt population today, which is a transboundary population. I'll tell you why now. So that Östgöt region is highly continental. So in the summer, really, really dry, very little rainfall. In the winter, pretty cold. Those are Saiga footprints you can see there, with snow. So it's a really harsh place for a Saiga to live. It's a place where Saigas have been in large numbers for millennia. It's a kind of it's a relic of the Pleistocene fauna that was over the steppe, you know, tens of thousands of years ago. So it was roaming the steppe with woolly rhinos, with saber-toothed cats, with mammoths, and that kind of thing. It's a great survivor of that fauna. These are a little bit more recent. So this shows kind of human engagement with the species for many, many centuries. So what you can see here is something called an aran, and the kind of the big one is, you can see it's a trap for hunting saigas. So you put the saigas are pushed into the bottleneck at the top, and then they gather at the bottom, and then they're killed for meat. That's from about the 12th century, probably. You can see how big it is by the picture there with the little 4x4 in the corner. So they're huge things. So they were hunted. They were also seen as culturally important. So there's an amulet that was taken a photo in a Uzbek house, and then they also have been traded over many millennia again for Chinese traditional medicine. And that's a picture I took in a shop in Hong Kong quite recently. So in the 19th century, they were very abundant, but they were hunted by the Russian Empire. So just like in Africa, you had all these Europeans, British people going out hunting all the wild game and then saying, oh no, I killed the last rhino in South Africa. That's really sad. Similar things happened with Saigas with people from the Russian court. So you can see here in the mid-19th century, they were seen as really, really abundant on the steppe. Then horns were taken out through the border forts of the Russian Empire until such time as they were getting really, really scarce. And then finally, the Soviet Union came, the border with China was closed, and the species was able to recover back to pretty much where it was before. Unfortunately, then, at the breakup of the Soviet Union, there was a loss of law and order, and so the borders with China were opened again. Horn sales again could flow through to China. There was a lack of economic opportunity on the steppe, and so villages were ruined. People turned to two things to make money: saiga hunting and titanium gathering. Pretty random livelihoods. The titanium gathering was because of the Baikonur space station, and as rockets were launched, the titanium fell onto the steppe, and there was no money anymore for law and order, so for enforcement. That led to heavy poaching and saigas being again traded into China by people who were both desperate for money, but also, did have no other livelihoods really. And what we got then was the steepest decline, I think, recorded in a mammal. So we lost 95% of the population in 10 years over that period of the breakup of the Soviet Union as heavy poaching happened. So you can see in this graph, this is the Kazakh saiga population kind of bouncing around over time in the 80s. That big gap is when there was no money anymore for monitoring. When monitoring resumed, the population had halved, and it halved every year for the next 5 years. So that caused some pretty bad stuff. In response to all of that, what happened was that NGOs started to come together, range state scientists started to come together, and we got a MOU on saiga conservation under the Convention on Migratory Species. And that was signed in 2006 by all the major countries. We set up an NGO called the Saiga Conservation Alliance, which is still going strong, and worked with other people in the range states to start to turn this species around. And actually, as someone who was a real skeptic about international MOUs and the way in which they actually made difference on the ground, this really did, because the governments took it very seriously and started to invest in conservation. People started to do camera trapping, started to do monitoring. There was a lot of educational activity. There were some alternative livelihoods around traditional crafts like these women here in northern Uzbekistan. And Saiga, being the great species it is, responded. The population boomed extraordinarily. It's a species that's pre-adapted to steppe living. So because it's pre-adapted to living in kind of very extreme conditions where there's a lot of death from climate events, it's able to reproduce really fast. And you can see that here. So the black one is the Betpat Dala population that was increasing incredibly dramatically. And then the dotted line is the world population in the west, again, increasing pretty dramatically. I draw your attention to the red line, which is the Usturt population that I said before is the one I'm going to focus on. Just as a side note, I don't have time to go into it. You can ask me questions later. The big drop in both of those populations is disease. The thing about the fact that it's such a kind of fecund species that breeds so fast, it's also very prone to disease. So the Ural one was to do with something called fog fever, when the grass gets too wet and it gets bloated. And the one in Betpat Dala is to do with a Pasteurella infection, a bacterium that's commenced in the nose normally and then suddenly went to virulence, and this happened. This was in May 2015, 200,000 Saigas died in 2 weeks, which was 88% of that population and 62% of the entire global population. So that was a bit of a setback. They're fine now, by the way. This is just homing in on the Usturt population. So you saw that red line hadn't changed at all, except to get worse, really. So how come the other populations are booming and this one isn't? Well, a couple of things. The first thing is continued poaching. There was continued poaching there, which didn't allow them to recover. The second one is infrastructure. So you can see the red line is a railway that's being built across their calving grounds. This is the dark blue, by the way, is a track of satellite collared Saigas. So you can see where they move. So right through their range, they're building a railway. The orange line is a border fence, and that was put up in 2012 by Kazakhstan as a kind of customs union between Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Russia. And that impeded the movements of the Saigas very much. You can see some of the lines of them going along the fence, trying to find a way through. So there is the fence. I mean, I don't think that's going to stop a committed drug smuggler with a pair of secateurs, but it certainly stops migrating antelopes. So yes, this heavy poaching continued in Usturt and has led to, just a lack of improvement in that population. So now I'm going to try and bring this to something optimistic for that population. And to do that, I'm going to have to step out a little bit further into the region in which this Usturt population is living. And that is the region of the Aral Sea, which you may or may not have heard of. So the Aral Sea is the 4th largest inland water body in the world. It's something that has been kind of important to civilizations over the millennia. Alexander had a city there. It's known from classical times. It was a very bountiful sea, one that had beautiful deltas where you could have lots of growing of vegetables in a desert. So, a real oasis. It was a huge port in Soviet times, one of the biggest military ports in the Soviet times. A huge exporter of fish to all the Soviet Union and its satellite states. But unfortunately, also that rich, fertile region was hugely exploited for cotton growing during the Soviet times. And cotton is incredibly hungry of water and also needs a lot of pesticide. Cotton growing was the major export from Uzbekistan during that whole time. In fact, it's still a third of its exports. And that diverted huge amounts of water from the rivers that were feeding the Aral Sea into these cotton fields, which led to salination, health problems, and the thing that the Aral Sea is sadly most famous for, ecological catastrophe. So probably still, I say still, like the largest man-made environmental disaster we've had. I think there's going to be others coming up on the wings quite soon, but this for a long time anyway was the largest. So you can see here this huge sea in the 1970s shrinking, so that by 2014 it was virtually nothing. It's just a salt pan. Here's how it looks. So that kind of construction site is where they were trying to keep the sea navigable. They built a canal into the middle of the sea before they gave up and just left. And that cliff there is where the water edge used to be. So here it is now, Google Earth image now, and this is the main town, Munak, which is on the edge of what was the delta. This is the area where the Saigars were, which you saw on that satellite track. And this is an aptly named island called Resurrection Island, which is where the optimism sort of comes in. That the blue is where the sea is, and the green to the right of Resurrection Island is algae, so it's not actually. So Resurrection Island was a strange place. It was closed through the Soviet periods. It was a military bioweapons site. So here's some nice snaps from the Soviet times of the kind of closed town where all the scientists and their children lived. Here it is a bit later. Now most of this has been destroyed. There's been scavengers in who've just taken everything, which is a shame because you could do some really cool kind of disaster tourism, I think. Where's the optimism, we ask ourselves? Well, in 2012, the government allowed people to go to the island again. So it was deemed no longer a biohazard, no longer a military secret, and you can get along a kind of a causeway and go to the island. So as well as the scavengers, my colleagues, biologists, went and had a look. They found something pretty cool. So that island had been separated from the mainland for quite some centuries, and it had a unique flora and fauna that had not been subject to the grazing that the other parts of the area had been, because it was an island. Had really good populations of various kinds of wildlife, interesting flora, and saigars. So these are some saigar footprints on the dried up seabed, and the saigars survived even as the people came to poach and to scavenge on the island, because they could run out onto the seabed if being chased, where you would not, in any sensible person would not drive a jeep. So they're being captured on camera traps. Here's a lovely fluffy male saigar in his winter wear. And that Aral Sea bed is starting to grow into something that is not the Aral Sea, because we're never going to get the Aral Sea back, even if the cotton stopped, it's just ruined. But it's still something that has some kind of ecological value. So the government has been planting tamarisk trees to try to stabilize the sands, because those sands have been blowing pesticides and salt across a vast area of northern Uzbekistan, causing cancers, respiratory problems, and all sorts of other things. So they needed to stabilize the sands. So they've been planting these trees. There's still some kind of areas of water. It's actually, there's birds there. There's wildlife there, and it's not a dead loss, environmentally speaking. It's just not a sea anymore. So, based upon these observations, and based upon a trip that I and colleagues took in 2018 to have a little scope around, my colleague Jo Bull and Lena Bujkova did a project funded by the Darwin Initiative and various other colleagues as well, Whitley Fund for Nature, the Wildlife Conservation Network, and the People's Trust for Endangered Species, to try to think about what could we do to conserve saigars and wildlife and make Resurrection Island something that actually lives up to its name. So they did some monitoring, and these are all the things they found. Loads of flamingos in the salt pans, saigars, foxes, all sorts of fun stuff. So that there is wildlife on that Aral Sea bed now, and the big concentration you can see up the top right is where the island is. ran lots of work with local people to do ecotourism, to get themselves homestays, to get trained up, working with tourism companies based in Tashkent and Samarkand about how they could do eco tours of the area. Lots of work with children, lots of work with biologists, rangers to kind of get them trained up in monitoring. Lots of thinking with the industry that are in the area. There's lots of gas deposits about how they could contribute to nature conservation through biodiversity offsetting and through mitigating their impacts. And finally, a lot of work with government officials, which is this top right one here, to think about how could we protect this island with its precious ecosystem for the future. And in 2022, the Arakum Nature Reserve was designated by the government on the seabed of the Aral Sea, including Resurrection Island, as something that is actually there to protect nature. So is that a positive story? Well, for me it is, because although we've seen massive environmental degradation, we have something new coming and something that is good for nature in its way, different nature. Well, let's put the optimism to one side and you can ponder whether you think it is or not. Now, why think about this? Conservationists need optimism. So in a study that one of my PhD students did, Tom Piankowski, he looked at all the different things that might affect whether conservationists are feeling more or less psychologically distressed. And psychological distress is a construct that kind of has some relationship to depression and other kind of mental illness. And you can see that some of the things that Tom found were that if you felt like you were making a difference, if you felt like your particular site was going okay, then you were less distressed. So that's good. And I've got some quotes here from the people who answered his survey, which I think, would resonate with all of us. We will lose everything and our children will have a very tough life if we fail to address the biodiversity crisis. I feel I'm out of step with the rest of the world. I'm hopeless. I can't achieve. I feel that there's hopelessness here. So those are some of the things that are very resonant with me and with others. But there's other things that are resonant on the positive side. So I feel like if I am successful, I work harder, work better. Sharing with other people is really important, the fact that I'm part of a movement. So bearing that in mind, and particularly bearing in mind what I said about my responsibility to my students and the fact that I'd just come back from the Saima Protected Area in Cambodia, I went to the Cambridge Student Conference on Conservation Science, and Nancy Knowlton from the Smithsonian Institute gave a talk about her work for ocean optimism. And I sat there and I thought, it's what we need. We need some optimism, but for conservationists to help us as a community and the public in general to feel that there is some hope. So Optimism was born. We had a summit in 2017. We actually had one in September this year, which was the third one. And brilliant, amazing, inspiring, bringing people together to feel, a sense of community. We've got a lovely website and we've got a brilliant team. You can see from this picture that it's very diverse. It's a team from all over the world who are working together to try to kind of build a community. We've now got 4 hubs in 4 different countries. And we've got over 200 partners. So these small and big NGOs from around the world who share our mission and value. And the main thing is not to say that there is no problem, because clearly there is a problem, but that when we talk about those problems with the general public, then we talk about them in a way that doesn't leave people feeling hopeless, that gives an action step that they can take, or that says, this is what we're doing, this is what you can do to make things better. So that's great, but conservation is not enough in itself. So this is a very famous graph that was produced by Leclerc et al. And it was modelling different kinds of futures depending on whether you did conservation, so protected areas, or whether you were actually kind of changing our systems of production and consumption. So the grey line is business as usual, and you'll be heartened to see that, with nothing to do with me, the very last mammal standing is a saiga. The yellow line is what happens if you just do conservation really well. So we can do conservation as well as we can, and it's not going to be enough. What we have to do is change the way that our society operates in order to actually get the nature back that we need in order to thrive and survive. Now, in principle, we have the frameworks that would enable us and allow us and instruct us to do this. We have the Sustainable Development Goals, which talks about human well-being and actually has a lot of environmental targets in there. We have the UNFCCC, which tries to get us to 1.5 degrees. We have, since December 2022, the Global Biodiversity Framework under the Convention on Biological Diversity, which has a load of really good targets, which 196 countries, including our own, has signed up to. So, in principle, super. We have industry taking things seriously. So, for example, the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures is trying to support, encourage, cajole companies to disclose their their impacts on biodiversity and do something about it. And there's a number of those initiatives out there. And we still have people protesting. So this is the Restore Nature Now March, which was earlier this year. Maybe not as many people as we could have hoped for, and maybe not as much press coverage as we could have hoped for, but there are still people out there feeling that they want to make a difference. So with all of that, why is it that our biodiversity is still declining? Why is it that we're not meeting any of our targets and that things seem not to be turning around? Well, I find this an optimistic graph as well. So what this graph is, it needs a bit of explaining, is can you see there's a grey line right at the top, a very faint grey line, which is the number of states in the USA. And then each of these lines are when states adopt legislation on a particular topic. And what you can see is that, and the circles are when every state adopts it. So it becomes federal law. What you can see is that what you get is very typical with tipping points, is you get lots and lots of just sitting around and nothing happening and nothing happening, nothing happening. Then you suddenly get this societal tipping point where it suddenly increases and it's the thing that everyone does and it happens. So are we at that stage now where we're feeling like we're like Sisyphus pushing a stone up the mountain and it's coming down, and pushing the stone, it's coming down? Are we getting to the point where we're getting to the mountain and falling over the other side? Well, I would say yes, but I would. But I think, the fact that we feel like we're walking through treacle, to use another metaphor, doesn't mean that we're not at the point of a societal transformation, and perhaps we are. So in order to have that societal transformation, it needs to be a whole of society transformation. It can't just be something that is the province of the left wing or the environmentally friendly types. It has to be something that everyone, regardless of which newspaper they read, and we have in these pictures a Telegraph reader and a Guardian reader, and possibly a Daily Mail reader as well. Anyway, all of these people need to say that they are conservationists. Nature should not be a political issue. Nature should be a societal issue. These are a random selection of my family. But, I think illustrating the point that everybody should be able to feel like nature is something that they care about. So, what have I said? I've said with my illustration of the Saima forest in Cambodia that conservation faces these huge systemic issues. Even keeping going, even the fact that we are still here, the nature is still here, is an achievement in itself. And I don't think we should lose sight of that. The Resurrection Island project, slightly more interesting, is perhaps that, nature and people are resilient. So this was a destroyed area, both for people and for nature. We do need to think about the future differently. So the future perhaps is not going to be the same as the past, but that doesn't mean that it has no value. I also think that we do actually know now how to do conservation. There are many, many successes in conservation at the local level. You just look at any of the things that you get from the Wildlife Trusts. Look at, Darwell Wildlife Conservation Trust, where Carl Jones has not single-handedly, but he led the saving of 4 species in Mauritius. So we have successes. We can scale them up, but we're just not doing it because we don't have the money, we don't have the political will. So in order to do that, in order to make these societal changes, we have to engage people. We have to make people angry, yes, but then we have to make them feel that they have some agency and some positivity and not get them despairing. We also know what the systemic issues are in our society that we need to address in order to move consumption and production into a more sustainable way. The second half of that graph of shifting the curve. We know that our food systems need to be fixed. We know how to fix the food systems as well. Eat less meat, don't import soy that's been grown from deforested land in the Cerrado, these kinds of things. We know that we need to shift our energy system, but we need to do it in a way that is nature friendly. So we have these systemic headwinds. We have a lot of conflict in the world. We have a lot of backlash, I think, from vested interests. We have the opportunity to kind of empower communities in small areas. So the question then is, how can we actually take that empowerment and use it to address these systemic issues? I don't necessarily have the answers, but. So what do scientists need to do? And I think one of the things that we do need to do is to frame things in this triple challenge way, that we have a climate crisis, we have a crisis of human well-being, food security, and we also have a biodiversity crisis, and those are interlinked, and you get positive and negative interactions between these 3. Now, I think it's relatively straightforward to go to a decision maker, to a politician, to talk about the climate crisis and talk about the flooding, the wildfires, the droughts. It's easy. People get it now because it's happening to us right now. The biodiversity crisis is also happening to us right now, but it's much harder to sell it as something that is fundamental to our way of life. Because I don't think we're yet making those links between loss of biodiversity and our well-being and way of life right now. Those links are there to be made, but they're not clear yet. So going to a minister or going to a captain of industry and saying, you have to solve the biodiversity crisis, because if you do not, we will lose the lungs of the earth. We will lose our ability to grow food. We will lose our ability to sequester carbon. Those arguments are much less clearly made, and that's where I think the science needs to be focused. So Gerald Durrell in 1972 was, as usual, way ahead of the curve and said this rather beautiful, sad quote about ripping holes in the fabric of life. And I think that's just as pertinent, more pertinent now than it has ever been. So I'm going to leave you with some optimism and some reasons to go on. And these were people who came to our Conservation Optimism Summit in 2017, and just some of the things that made them, as professional conservationists, optimistic. So you can't see the top of the mountain if it's covered in clouds. Perseverance is the key, and I believe we are here to win the battle. The world needs me to believe, and I need to believe. Without optimism, there is no conservation. If everyone contributes to the movement, we can truly make the world a better place. Humans don't want to live alone. I've seen evidence we can make a difference. And my favourite, trees make me smile. So, Merry Christmas to you, and thank you for listening.